In June of 1952, a man crawled through a narrow stone passage that no human being had entered in nearly 1,300 years, and what he found at the bottom would force scientists to rewrite everything they thought they knew about the pyramids of Mexico. Behind a triangular door, sealed since the 7th century, sat a stone box weighing 5 tons, carved on every surface, guarded by the bones of 6 people who had never left that chamber alive. When the lid was finally lifted, archaeologists found a king still wearing his jewelry, his face covered by 200 pieces of jade, lying inside a coffin so massive it could not possibly have been carried down the stairs above it. That single fact would launch one of the strangest engineering mysteries of the 20th century, and decades later it would still be raising questions nobody has fully answered. The city of Palenque sits in the state of Chiapas, in southern Mexico, tucked into the foothills where the highlands drop down into the Gulf Coast lowlands. Rivers cut through the site, mist collects in the mornings, and the surrounding rainforest presses in close enough that howler monkeys can be heard from the main plaza. For centuries after the Maya abandoned the city, sometime after 800 AD, the temples of Palenque stood half swallowed by jungle, their limestone facades stained green, their interiors assumed to be nothing more than solid fill topped by a small ceremonial room. That assumption was not unreasonable. Every Maya pyramid that had been studied up to that point functioned the same way the Aztec and other Mesoamerican pyramids did, as platforms. A temple sat on top. Priests performed ceremonies there, and the mass of stone and rubble beneath was structural, not sacred. Nobody had found a body inside one. Nobody expected to. That changed because of a floor. In the late 1940s, Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz Huillier began a systematic excavation of the largest pyramid at Palenque, a 9-tiered structure now known as the Temple of the Inscriptions because of the lengthy hieroglyphic texts carved into its upper chamber. Ruz noticed something odd about one of the floor slabs inside that upper temple. Unlike the rest of the flooring at the site, this slab was cut from a different type of stone, and it had 2 rows of drilled holes running along its surface, each one plugged with a fitted stone stopper. At the edges of the slab were shallow indentations, just large enough for fingers to grip. In a body of architecture where nothing was accidental, this looked deliberately built to be lifted. When Ruz's team pried the slab up, they did not find a floor underneath it. They found a staircase descending into total darkness, packed from top to bottom with rubble and rock that had clearly been placed there on purpose. Someone had built a passage into the heart of the pyramid, used it, and then sealed it shut. That kind of effort does not happen by accident, and it does not happen for nothing. Whatever waited at the bottom of that staircase, someone had gone to enormous trouble to make sure it stayed hidden. Palenque itself had already been known to outsiders for centuries by the time Ruz began digging. Spanish colonial officials recorded the ruins as early as the 18th century, and by the 19th century the site had drawn explorers, artists, and early archaeologists who documented its temples and palaces without ever suspecting that one of them concealed a burial. The city had flourished during the classic Maya period, roughly between the 3rd and 9th centuries AD, before being abandoned along with most of the great lowland Maya centers in a decline that archaeologists still debate, generally attributing it to some combination of prolonged drought, warfare between rival city-states, agricultural strain, and political fragmentation. By the time Ruz arrived, Palenque had spent over 1,000 years as ruins reclaimed by rainforest, its temples known and studied from the outside, but never fully understood from within. Clearing it took 4 full excavation seasons, spread across roughly 4 years of work between 1948 and 1952. The stairwell was steep, narrow, and hot, and every basket of rubble had to be hauled out by hand through a passage barely wide enough for one person. Progress was slow enough that it was measured in centimeters per session. The staircase ran for 45 steps, turned at a landing, and continued down again, dropping a total of roughly 25 meters, nearly the full height of the pyramid, until it reached ground level, well below the base of the structure itself. At the bottom, the team found a small stone box filled with ceremonial offerings, and in front of a sealed doorway, the skeletal remains of 6 young individuals, positioned deliberately rather than scattered by accident. Their presence there was consistent with what is understood about elite Maya burial practice. Attendants or sacrificial companions, interred at the moment of final sealing, meant to accompany an important person into the afterlife and continue serving them there. Their placement was itself a signal. Whoever lay beyond that door had been significant enough to warrant that kind of send-off. The door itself was unusual, a massive triangular slab of stone fitted into a triangular opening in the wall, pivoting on a stone peg at its base so that it could rotate open rather than needing to be lifted or slid. Triangular doorways appear at other points in Maya architecture connected to the underworld, and this one had not moved since sometime in the 600s AD. On June 15, 1952, Ruse and his team worked it open and became the first people in roughly 1,300 years to breathe the air sealed inside. What the flashlight beams found first were the walls. 9 life-sized stucco figures modeled in relief, representing what scholars would later identify as the 9 lords of the Maya underworld night, standing sentry around the chamber. The room itself measured about 9 meters long and 4 meters wide, roofed with the corbelled vault typical of Maya construction, in which each course of stone steps slightly inward until the 2 sides meet at a narrow capstone rather than a true arch. Centuries of water seeping through the stone above had formed small stalactites hanging from that vaulted ceiling, a slow mineral clock marking the roughly 1,200 years the chamber had sat undisturbed. And at the center of the room was the sarcophagus. It was carved from a single limestone block, with a lid measuring nearly 4 meters long and over 2 meters wide, weighing approximately 5 tons. Both the coffin and its lid were carved with dense, continuous imagery and hieroglyphic text, and together with its stone base, the entire burial monument constituted one of the largest single funerary structures ever documented in the ancient Americas. That size is what created the mystery. The staircase Ruse had spent years digging out was narrow, with tight turns and a steep pitch built for a person, not for hauling a 5-ton stone slab. There is no plausible way that lid could have been carried down that passage after the pyramid was already standing. Archaeologists studying the site concluded that the sequence of construction had to run in the opposite direction from what common sense would suggest. The burial chamber and sarcophagus were built first, at ground level, likely even before Pakal's death, and the pyramid itself was raised up and around that chamber afterward, over a period of years, with the staircase added specifically as a route of access and later ceremonial connection, rather than as a delivery route for the coffin. Running alongside that staircase, embedded in the rubble, fill the entire way from the burial chamber to the temple floor above, archaeologists also found a narrow stone tube, barely wide enough to fit a finger through, that tracked every twist of the staircase's path. This is sometimes called a psychoduct, or spirit channel, and while its exact function remains a matter of scholarly interpretation, the leading explanation ties it to Maya beliefs about death not as an ending, but as a transition. The dead were not considered simply gone. They remained present in some form, and a narrow conduit running from the sealed tomb up to the world of the living fits a worldview in which the deceased king stayed connected to the ceremonies performed above him. Building a channel like that, precisely routed through solid rubble fill for 25 meters, along with building an entire 9-level pyramid around a single burial chamber, is not a modest undertaking. It required the resources and authority of a very powerful ruler, commanding labor on a massive scale over a long span of time. When photographs of the sarcophagus lid's carving began circulating in the years after the discovery, the image became instantly famous, not for what archaeologists said about it, but for what one writer claimed it showed. In 1968, Eric von Däniken published a best-selling book arguing that ancient civilizations around the world had been visited, and in some cases taught, by extraterrestrial beings. He reproduced the Palenque lid and argued that if you rotate the image and look at it a certain way, the central figure appears to be seated in a reclined position, operating some kind of control mechanism with fire or exhaust shooting from a nozzle below him, and a cone-shaped structure rising above his head, resembling a rocket. He described it as a depiction of an ancient astronaut piloting a spacecraft. The book sold in the tens of millions of copies, arriving at a moment when the Apollo program had just put human beings on the moon, and the public imagination was primed to find rockets everywhere it looked. The interpretation does not hold up, and the reasons why are instructive. Von Däniken displayed the image rotated roughly 90 degrees from its correct orientation, which is not how Maya artists intended it to be read and viewed correctly, in consultation with the conventions of Maya religious art. None of the elements he described are actually present. There is no spacecraft and no astronaut. What is there is more intricate and considerably more meaningful, once you understand the visual language it was written in. Decoding that visual language took decades of dedicated scholarship by epigraphers who specialize in Maya hieroglyphic writing and iconography. Their conclusion is that the lid depicts the moment of Pakal's death rendered as a specific and recognizable cosmological event. The central figure is shown falling backward, a posture Maya art consistently used to represent descent into the underworld, not flight into the sky. He falls toward the open jaws of an earth deity positioned at the base of the composition, representing the entrance to the underworld, the Maya called Xibalba. What von Däniken read as a rocket engine with exhaust flames is understood by specialists as the head and coiling body of a serpent associated with the underworld. What he read as instrument panels and controls corresponds to the faces, claws, and skeletal features of underworld beings arranged around the falling king, consistent with imagery found on other Maya monuments depicting death and transformation. Rising above the central figure is what is identified as the world tree, a recurring symbol in Maya cosmology representing the axis connecting the 3 levels of the universe, the underworld below, the everyday world of the living in the middle, and the heavens above. It is typically shown as a cross-shaped form with roots reaching down and branches extending upward, often topped by a celestial bird associated with the principal sky deity. On the lid, that structure occupies the position von Däniken interpreted as a rocket's nose cone. Read correctly, the whole composition becomes a theological statement rather than a technical one. A dying king descending into the underworld while the axis of the cosmos rises above him, connecting the realm of the dead to the realm of the living and the heavens beyond, watched over by the highest deity in the Maya pantheon. Surrounding hieroglyphic text on the sarcophagus records the ruler's name, his lineage, and dates tied to his birth, accession, and death, framed in relation to astronomical cycles, including the movements of the planet Venus, a body closely associated in Maya belief with themes of death and renewal. This is not a lesser explanation than an ancient astronaut. It is a considerably more sophisticated one, describing a fully realized religious and political worldview, expressed through an artistic and writing tradition that took specialists most of the 20th century to learn to read with any confidence. The idea that ancient Maya artisans required outside intervention to produce something this intricate says more about the assumptions of the people making that claim than it does about the people who actually carved the stone. It is worth pausing on why that misreading spread so widely, because the mechanism matters as much as the mistake itself. Von Däniken was not a trained epigrapher, and the ancient astronaut framework he applied treats visual complexity as inherently suspicious, as though any culture without metal tools or wheeled vehicles must have been incapable of producing sophisticated art or engineering on its own. That framework has been applied over the years to the pyramids of Egypt, the lines at Nazca, and the stoneheads of Easter Island, among other sites, and in every one of those cases, patient archaeological and epigraphic work has produced explanations grounded in the actual skill, labor, and belief systems of the people who built them. Mainstream Maya scholarship does not dispute that the carving on Pakal's lid is extraordinary. It disputes the idea that extraordinary automatically means foreign. The distinction matters because it shapes whether we credit the actual civilization that produced something remarkable or quietly hand that credit to a theory with no supporting evidence. The discovery also mattered enormously for archaeology as a discipline well beyond the borders of Palenque. Before 1952, the working assumption across Mesoamerican archaeology was that pyramids in the Maya world served the same basic role as platforms for temples, distinct from the pyramid as tomb tradition associated with ancient Egypt. Roos's excavation demonstrated conclusively that at least some Maya pyramids were built, specifically as elaborate funerary monuments, prompting archaeologists to re-examine other major structures across the Maya region with fresh eyes. Several subsequent tombs have since been identified inside pyramids at other sites, though none with the scale, preservation, or symbolic completeness of Pakal's burial chamber. In recognition of its importance, the Temple of the Inscriptions and the broader archaeological zone of Palenque were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1987, cementing its status as one of the defining sites of ancient Mesoamerican civilization. When the lid was finally raised off the sarcophagus using car jacks and wooden beams, the interior stopped the excavation team in its tracks. Everything inside, the bones, the surrounding stone, the objects laid around the body, was coated in a deep red powder. That color came from cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury sulfide that Maya elites used in burials to symbolize blood and the ongoing cycle of death and rebirth. 12 centuries of undisturbed settling had preserved that color in vivid form, turning the interior of the coffin into a single, unmistakable symbolic statement before a single artifact was even examined. Lying within that red interior was a human skeleton, and covering its face was one of the most extraordinary funerary objects ever recovered in the Americas. A mosaic death mask assembled from roughly 200 individual pieces of jade, cut, shaped, and fitted together to reconstruct a human face, with eyes inlaid in white shell and dark obsidian. For Maya elites, jade carried a symbolic weight roughly comparable to gold in other cultures, but rooted specifically in ideas about breath and life force, tied linguistically and visually to the green of young maize, the crop at the center of Maya subsistence and cosmology. Covering a dead king's face in jade was not simple display of wealth. It was a statement about transformation, that this was not an ending, but a continuation in another form. The rest of the body was similarly adorned. Rings, bracelets, and necklaces built from hundreds of individual jade beads, a jade bead placed in each hand, and another placed in the mouth, sometimes referred to as a breath bead, tied to the idea of preserving what animated the person even after death. Obsidian and pyrite ornaments were found at the wrists and ankles. In total, the quantity of jade recovered from this single burial exceeded that of any other Maya tomb discovered up to that point, and the objects were eventually cataloged and moved to Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology, where the mask remains one of the most recognized artifacts from the ancient Americas. The sarcophagus itself was too large and fragile to relocate and remains in place inside the pyramid to this day. Identifying exactly who was buried there took considerably longer than finding the tomb itself, because the systematic decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing was still in its early stages in the 1950s. As that decoding progressed over the following decades, the surrounding inscriptions revealed a name, Kinich Janab Pakal, sometimes rendered as Pakal the Great, with Kinich meaning something close to sun-faced, a title linking the ruler to Maya solar deities. According to those inscriptions, he was born in 603 AD, came to the throne of Palenque at the age of 12 in 615 AD, and died in 683 AD at the age of 80, after a reign of 68 years, one of the longest documented in ancient Maya history, and long enough to outlast Queen Victoria's reign over the British Empire more than a millennium later. That number created a genuine scientific problem. When physical anthropologists first examined the skeleton in the 1950s, using standard forensic indicators such as bone density, joint condition, and dental wear, their estimate placed the age at death somewhere between 40 and 45, roughly half the age recorded in the inscriptions. That is not a minor rounding error. It is a direct contradiction, and it fueled genuine scholarly debate for decades. Some researchers argued that Maya rulers were known to inflate the length of their reigns for political and religious legitimacy, and questioned whether the skeleton in the tomb was even Pakal himself, or perhaps someone else interred in a monument built partly as propaganda. Others argued the forensic methods being applied were not accounting for factors specific to this individual and his circumstances. A later re-examination in the 1990s used histological analysis, examining thin cross-sections of bone tissue under magnification rather than relying solely on external features like joint wear. And this method produced results far more consistent with an age close to 80. The likely explanation for the earlier younger estimate involves diet and lifestyle. As a ruler, Pakal would have eaten a diet far softer and less abrasive than that of ordinary Maya commoners, whose worn teeth and joint stress from manual labor formed the baseline forensic anthropologists were originally calibrated against. A king who ate cacao drinks and prepared meals his entire life would show far less physical wear than a farmer of the same age, throwing off age estimates built on population averages rather than individual circumstance. The bones, in other words, were not lying. They simply reflected the life of someone who had never done hard physical labor a day in his life, and the inscriptions describing a 68-year reign are now generally accepted by scholars as accurate. The world Pakal inherited at age 12 was not stable. In the years before his birth, Palenque had suffered a serious military defeat at the hands of Calakmul, one of the most powerful Maya city-states of the period, which had built an extensive network of allied and subordinate cities across the Maya lowlands. That defeat, recorded in the inscriptional history of the region, left Palenque politically vulnerable at the moment a child took the throne. Part of what allowed the young ruler to survive that vulnerable period was his mother, Lady Sak Cook, who held power as regent during his early years, an unusual arrangement in a political system generally organized around male succession. Inscriptions and sculptural programs from early in Pakal's reign depict her in terms usually reserved for powerful rulers, suggesting she played a serious and direct role in stabilizing the kingdom during the period before her son could govern alone. Over the following decades, Pakal transformed Palenque from a weakened, threatened city into one of the most architecturally accomplished centers in the Maya world. The building style associated with the site today, marked by delicate stucco relief work, mansard-style roofs, and graceful corbelled vaulting, reached its fullest expression under his patronage. The inscriptions he commissioned functioned as more than decoration. They were historical and political records, asserting legitimacy by tying his birth, accession, military actions, and eventual death to celestial events, particularly the movements of Venus, reinforcing the idea, central to Maya kingship generally, that a ruler's life was woven directly into the operation of the cosmos, rather than being separate from it. The pyramid built to house his remains was the physical culmination of that claim, a monument designed from the ground up around a single body, engineered so that everything about its construction, from the spirit channel running alongside the staircase to the imagery carved into the coffin lid, reinforced a coherent religious and political statement. For decades after Ruza's excavation, it seemed as though the tomb had given up everything it had to offer. The artifacts were catalogued, the inscriptions were gradually translated as the broader field of Maya epigraphy matured, and the interior staircase was eventually closed to public visitors because the moisture and carbon dioxide produced by thousands of tourists were visibly damaging the stucco reliefs inside. Then, in 2016, archaeologists, using ground-penetrating radar, a technique that maps subsurface features by measuring how radio waves reflect off different materials underground, detected something unexpected running directly beneath the Temple of the Inscriptions, passing under the burial chamber itself, a tunnel distinct from the excavated staircase, following the course of a natural water channel that had been deliberately modified and incorporated into the pyramid's construction. This was not entirely out of character for the site. Palenque as a whole shows a sophisticated approach to hydraulic engineering, with several streams running through the city that the Maya channeled and controlled using aqueducts, in some cases specifically designed to generate water pressure for functional or ceremonial purposes. But a channel positioned directly beneath a royal tomb suggests something beyond ordinary drainage management. In Maya belief, the underworld, Xibalba, was closely associated with water, imagined as a realm crossed by rivers and connected to subterranean and oceanic waters. Routing an actual underground water channel beneath the king's burial chamber would have made the symbolic architecture of the tomb literal, placing a real river directly beneath a ruler whose coffin lid depicted him descending into a watery underworld, connected upward through a spirit channel to the world of the living above. That discovery also introduced a genuine ongoing concern. A pyramid built directly over a modified natural water channel faces long-term structural risk as groundwater levels shift and the stone above continues to settle, and conservation efforts at Palenque today have to account for the very feature that once made the tomb symbolically complete. Taken as a whole, the tomb of Pakal represents one of the most complete and well-documented windows into classic Maya civilization that archaeology has ever produced, precisely because every element of it, the staircase, the spirit channel, the sarcophagus carving, the jade mask, the underground water channel, and the inscriptions naming and dating the man buried there, work together as parts of a single coherent system of belief. None of it required an explanation from outside human history. The Maya independently developed one of only a handful of fully original writing systems ever created anywhere in the world, tracked astronomical cycles with a precision that still holds up today, and used a mathematical concept of 0 centuries before it reached Europe. What sits beneath the Temple of the Inscriptions is not evidence that ancient people needed help to achieve what they achieved. It is evidence of exactly the opposite, what a civilization is capable of on its own, when its political power, its engineering knowledge, and its religious worldview all reach maturity at the same time, under the direction of a ruler who held power for 68 years and used every one of them to build something meant to outlast him by more than 1,000 years. Kinich Janap Pakal did not need a spacecraft to leave behind one of the most remarkable tombs in human history. He needed the resources of a kingdom, the skill of generations of builders and artists, and a belief system detailed enough to turn a burial chamber into a working model of the universe. That was enough. If you want more real history dug up from beneath the myths, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment with the ancient mystery you want covered next, and give this video a like if you made it to the end, because it genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one.